Hey, Brian, good afternoon.
Hey, how's it
How
going,
you
Jorge?
doing?
1 second, 1 second. Give me like 5 seconds here.
I'll count us down. Hey, Brian.
Hey, Jorge, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Just hunkered down here on a snowy day. We just got some sleet, some ice, and some more snow. So
Oh,
it's about February in Philadelphia.
well, I will say we got the sun is like shining in Yellow Springs, and so I'm hoping the snow is going to melt so that I can get out of here for my next meeting. But yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're able to call in this afternoon. So I was thinking of a way to kind of frame the conversation from the start. And one of my favorite things that people always ask us is, so what do you do? And I feel like, and I was talking to you about this earlier before in the week, sometimes when you're talking about being an active transportation advocate, that kind of varies for people depending on if they're coming from a rural place or from an urban place, or where they are in the country. And I feel like you, as someone who works in local government and also is advocating on a state level, you're kind of like covering all that ground. You know what I mean? Like one day I know that you'd be in Cleveland, and the next day you're like at the bottom of the state, right? So I guess real quick, hey Brian, so what do you do at RTC?
So Jorge, I'm so glad you asked, and I'm fortunate to be able to dedicate my time to creating safe places for people to recreate responsibly, and that involves, in our world, walking, biking, and trails, and supporting that. And I think, one of our main focuses is the fact that we want to make sure that we are thinking about all ages, all abilities, and all backgrounds. And so anyway, and I think you got a cattail in there. My elevator speech is always a really exciting one, and it leads to a lot of other conversation. But I think part of your question about active transportation, which I think a lot about because my uncle Rich, who is one of our trailblazers, has oftentimes when we're talking about trails, if I mention active transportation, I just deer in the headlights. It doesn't really resonate. And, I think that has helped me to recognize that one of the things that we like to emphasize is that the transportation aspect is how we can gain more traction with the decision makers who might think a recreational trail is not as important as a transportation network. But I will also say, and I know we're going to talk more about this, that COVID has changed that. And one of the hearing from elected officials more than ever is particularly the mental well-being piece. And decision makers are really recognizing the importance of people to be able to get away and basically just achieve that mental wellness, and that's become a really important talking point.
Sure. Well, I mean, let's say decision makers, and I guess if you want to kind of flesh out more, introducing yourself. For RTC, you work as our Midwest policy manager. You're kind of herding the cats that are in the state legislature, right? But then you yourself are a decision maker. Do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. So
At the local level?
so I know some of the people on the call who I've gotten to ride a little bit with and connect with, know that I'm our council president for the village of Yellow Springs. And Yellow Springs is a very iconic, to say the least, community. We have Antioch College here. We're a village of about 3,700, but the per capita master and PhD degreed folks in this town is amongst the highest in the US. And, related to that, because we are a Buckeye Trail town, a bicycle friendly community, we're part of the nation's largest paved trail network. And some may know the Little Miami Scenic Trail goes right through Yellow Springs. Honestly, my council member parallels what I do with Rails to Trails so often. And part of that is because the trail economy is so critical to, I guess, what keeps Yellow Springs so vibrant. And I think one of those aspects is that we have an active transportation plan that the Ohio Department of Transportation supported. And we are now in the process of implementing that. So the fact that our Midwest regional office is in Yellow Springs, and some of you know Eric Oberg, my colleague, and the fact that Yellow Springs itself is doing so much related to active transportation has become a great incubator for some of the initiatives that we're doing nationwide.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that also because you sent me that article about what's going on in Indiana. And I have to ask, with the $90 million initiative that the governor's kind of thrown out there, chicken or egg? I know that you were working on the Trail Caucus for Indiana, and that all kind of was happening around the same time that the announcement for that funding came through. So where does that kind of stand? Was it the promise of that funding that kind of brought some people to the table, or was it the people already building that community pressuring the governor? And can you kind of touch on that story a little, since it's in a lot of ways similar to what you were doing in Ohio, right?
Yeah, it is an amazing story. And so one thing I'll put a placeholder on is competition for legislators is huge, but focusing specifically on Indiana, this has been a really incredible story. The Indiana Legislative Trails Caucus was established on March 5th of 2020. So basically a week before we went into lockdown. And over this, less than a year, the caucus has gone from the initial 9 members, and it's very bipartisan, to now 36 members. They've had 2 meetings. They have 2 pieces of legislation. One is making 2021 the year of the trails in Indiana, which is something we did in Ohio. And it's a really exciting thing to do, where whether events are virtual or in person, it's a great way to celebrate the trails. But the other thing that Indiana is doing to continue that legacy you mentioned, Jorge, is trying to establish a recurring funding mechanism for next level trails. Right now, the bill is asking for $5 million a year. And one of the things that Indiana is very excited about, and I think this is really created the traction more than anything else, is the Great American Rail Trail. I know probably most folks on the call know this is our cross-country trail going from DC to Washington State. And Indiana is one of the 13 states that the trail cuts through. And the legislators are very excited about the prospects for Indiana in terms of economic development, in terms of, public health. And this has been one of the things that I think has been a real driver, for the Hoosier state. So very fun to work with this group. But, I mentioned that placeholder. One of the things that's really exciting about working in the Midwest is when Ohio legislators hear about what Indiana's doing, that makes them want to step up. And, and I think that's an important thing for our advocates on the, call to understand, is reminding your representatives of what other states are doing toward our work.
Is that, in your opinion, one of the most effective ways for a trail advocate, let's say, on the ground to kind of work? I mean, as someone who replies to their constituents, could you kind of describe what do politicians or what do elected officials How do they react when they get phone calls like that?
Yeah. So I will definitely say, the bottom line is, as much as Rails to Trails is involved in, all of the advocacy, what really resonates with the decision makers are the stories that they hear from their constituents. So whenever we organize our Trails Advocacy Days, which we do at least once or twice a year in the states that we're actively involved in, it's very important for us to get like folks that have these experiences with the trails that they can relate to their elected officials. And I mean, you just can't imagine how far that goes. So related to those calls, since I think, things have to be more virtual these days, highlighting that connection to the trails that you have personally, along with highlighting what other states like Indiana is doing, if we're talking about Ohio or vice versa, can be really impactful. And I know early on we put out with Ohio this idea of Ohio being the California of the Midwest, which came from actually Kevin Mills, our senior VP of policy. And, we wondered how that would resonate, but I will say that legislators in Ohio grabbed onto that and we're very excited about being recognized as being innovative. So the competition thing matters for sure.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I think the last time I actually hung out with you or spending time together face to face might have been when we did the Trailblazer tour and we
I think
Yellow Springs to Cleveland.
Yep.
Yeah, so that was almost 2 years ago now.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of this time, the screen time. Has that how has that changed some of your advocacy work since you're not doing in-person meetings so much these days the past year?
So I will say, for a lot of our Midwest legislators, it took a little bit of time for them to get used to the virtual reality. But that being said, we are planning actually several Trails Advocacy Days in March. And, I think legislators, have gotten used to the Zoom and other platforms. So that's been really good. And there have been a lot of other advocacy days that we've been engaged with where the feedback has been really good. The interactions have been really good. I think a plus is that, it's a lot easier to schedule things because of the flexibility around the virtual environment. But I think all that being said, what's really exciting to me is that legislators are really attached to the idea that they need to support trails and active transportation infrastructure in a way that I have not seen in the past 6 years that I've been, involved in this work. So,
do you think a lot of that's just stemming from the pandemic kind of pushing and tugging on things in normal life that we weren't foreseeing, like people's reluctance maybe to use public transportation or to get in cars? Or
yeah, I think that's you totally nailed it. And I think part of it is, kind of as an extension is the idea that, just that mental well-being. I never have to see that thought. It's one of the first things that every legislator says when I interact with them. So that particular talking point is resonating very clearly with legislators. And, they're talking a lot about their own, needs to get, out on the trail, to take a walk, to, have like time to, think and regroup and whatnot. So I think that's the other thing that's good to remember is, I think sometimes like a state legislator, seems like on a pedestal to some extent, but the interactions we have are very much more, down to earth. And, everyone's kind of recognizing the struggles that people are having to the nth degree. So.
Now, as someone who's working out of Ohio and focusing on the Midwest, I always thought that the Ohio Trail Caucus, the Indiana Trail Caucus was so unique, because you have the bones there to kind of show people like, okay, here's a spine, here's how you can ride from Columbus to Cleveland, boom. How do you envision replicating that in different parts of the country if you had the opportunity?
Yeah, excellent question. And, one thing that's exciting is, right now, besides, Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin, which have been the 3 states that have really, kind of moved forward, we have 5 other states that are very actively working on creating a Trails Caucus. And one of the things that we have started to recognize is how unique every state, not to mention every jurisdiction is. So, when I think about like Wisconsin, for example, the interaction between the non-motorized and the motorized communities is huge. And for this policy initiative to gain traction, it's very important that we're working together in a coalition around that. And we've been, doing some really good work in that regard. Other states, like Ohio, there's not as much motorized trail use. So, the non-motorized piece is taking the lead. But I think the bottom line is every state is different. What's really cool is some of those other states I referenced include West Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. And we've been involved in some summits where we've been talking about, some of the things that, can help get those caucuses to gain some traction. But I guess the bottom line is, I think the issues and the lay of the land is unique enough in every state that it does like lend itself to thinking about who needs to be at the table and, also just what's the best strategy. It reminds me a lot of a local example that I'll talk about in a minute, but I think that's a good takeaway on the state level is every state is unique. And, when I think about our work in Wisconsin, where folks are so authentic and gritty, as opposed to, Indiana, where legislators are just super excited. And I honestly, they're taking the reins. And then, places like Ohio, where it's a little bit more conservative, each one of those states requires a different strategy.
Yeah, I guess that if you're working in North Carolina, you're not going to be thinking about those who are snowshoeing across the trail or using a snowmobile, right?
Exactly.
So one thing also that I want to talk to you a little bit about Ohio specifically was, as someone who's working at the local level, working at the state level, just do you have any of those like personal stories, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, that you kind of rally off the people? Because I know as someone who bikes quite a bit and grew up on a rail trail, like when I'm talking to people and trying to explain how our work's important, being able to reference like, hey, I grew up on a rail trail, it's the only green place I knew of as a kid. That speaks volumes. So when you're doing your local work, when you're doing your state work, is there anything in your personal life that you can be like, here you go?
Yeah. So I will say one of the coolest things about being council president in Yellow Springs is that I have a community that actually cares about active transportation and trails. And, that has really facilitated, I think I referenced a little bit, but for a community of our size, 3,700, we got an ODOT grant to develop an active transportation plan, which helped us to leverage $1.8 million to implement that plan. We've got our second round of Safe Routes to School, which is going to build a sidewalk that, along a road that has been super unsafe. So, I mean, it is awesome to, work in a community where walking and biking is prioritized. So I think kind of related to that, what's also been interesting, in this work has been the fact that as an elected official, I've thought a lot about, when we want to move initiatives forward, who needs to be at the table. And one of the initiatives that we are really excited about, it's been talked about for over 40 years, is a Yellow Springs Clifton connector. And so I know some of the people on the call are familiar with our area of Ohio, but basically, Yellow Springs, which is often talked about as being everyone's favorite place. Elle lives in the township. We've got a thriving downtown, lots of cool shops and whatnot. It's kind of your typical old school
Very idyllic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jorge is familiar, as are some others. But one of the projects that has been talked about for over 40 years is a connecting off of the Little Miami Scenic Trail to get out to Clifton Gorge. And this connects Glen Helen Nature Preserve, John Bryan State Park, and the Clifton Gorge. And then the village of Clifton is a smaller community near us. And I mean, this is a project that has, just the benefits are amazing in terms of access and, getting families and people that are not able to navigate the other entrances into Glen Helen. There's a Raptor Center, the Yellow Spring that, gives us our name. It's just been amazing. But, if I back up and look at how we are making this project happen, because after 40 some years, we are ready to pull the trigger. And part of that was making sure to get the right people at the table. So we had our state representatives, we had our county commissioners, we had our, Greene County Parks and Trails. This is also an initiative with not only the two villages, Yellow Springs and Clifton, but also Miami Township. And so that collaboration has been huge to make a project that's been talked about forever actually come to fruition. And I think that, is really where I love my role with Rails to Trails, because everything that we work on policy wise has direct applications to my local government role, and it also reminds me how important it is to engage state elected officials. And so that's really the total package. You've got to pull all those people together, and if you don't do it early in the process, it just makes the project a lot harder to complete.
Yeah, and now that this model's been shown to be successful in Ohio, Indiana, it gives us a template to kind of work on. When I asked you, what was the kind of the plans, I was hoping that you just whip out a playbook. In an ideal world, that's what it would look like. It was just a manual for how to get your state's trails dial moving, right? Unfortunately, we live in the real world where that is not always the case.
Yeah.
But I do want to thank you for taking some time. I'm looking at the clock here. I also want to thank everyone that tuned in today on this webinar to listen to Brian explain a little bit about his work in Ohio and beyond. And just to thank everyone who's a supporter of Rails to Trails Conservancy. I think that this past year, more than any point in my life, has shown how important trails have been. And, when you were speaking to the mental health aspect, I take an hour out of my day almost every single day to go on a walk, and I'm so happy to live a mile away from the Schuylkill River Trail and Forbidden Drive and these local trails that I used to bike to go to work every single day. And now I find myself going there every single day just for a moment of silence. to not have, my 2-year-old trying to bang on the computer as I'm trying to do a spreadsheet, right? So thanks, Brian. And is there anything else you want to close out with before we wrap up?
Yeah, I guess I just want to say that, given my state policy role, I am really excited about the prospects this year. We kind of came into this like wondering if it was mostly going to be in defensive mode and, making sure that we protect what we have. But I will say, I mentioned some of the things that are happening in Indiana, in Ohio, and Wisconsin. We are seeing states recognize, or state legislators recognize that they need to prioritize trails and active transportation infrastructure. And so I think, related to that, this is a great opportunity for our trailblazers and, our other folks that are really engaged in the work to reach out to their state legislators, let them know that these continue to be priorities. And we're feeling really good, not only on the state level, but particularly on the federal level, to see more funding for, again, the active transportation and trails infrastructure work that we're all engaged in. So, it was fun to talk. I am always happy to have offline conversations. Being a council president, even in a small village like Yellow Springs, is a constant challenge. And it's good to be reminded that this is important work to be committed to. So thanks, Jorge.
Thank you. And have a good weekend. And don't be late to your next appointment.
All right.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Take care.